Sejak beberapa tahun kebelakangan ini, Malaysia mengalami banjir yang melampau akibat perubahan iklim. Pada bulan Januari 2021, lebih daripada 20,000 orang dipindahkan dari pelbagai tempat di negara ini. Petani-petani di wilayah saya telah kehilangan sumber pendapatan mereka akibat banjir ini kerana ternakan dan hasil pertanian telah terkorban atau rosak. Rumah-rumah di kampung saya tidak dapat dipenghunikan kerana tanah runtuh akibat banjir. Akibat perubahan cuaca ini, saya dipaksa meninggalkan kampung saya. Inilah cerita hidup saya sebagai seorang pelarian iklim.
The word refugee itself is not just a legal term. When someone is a victim of domestic violence and runs home or runs to a shelter, they seek refuge there. They can be given some form of refuge, and the term applies there too. Where the legal definition is important is that it reflects a resistance, if I can put it that way, or a concern by states to find themselves in the obligation to provide that asylum to a growing number of refugees. So the issue is probably not the climate refugees in as much as there is a growing concern about cross-border migration and about refugees as a whole. We've seen this ever since the Syrian crisis, and the Global Compact on Refugees was an attempt at renewing global solidarity on displacement. However, what we've seen right now with what is going on in Afghanistan and previously also in Tigray in Ethiopia is that international solidarity is not living up to the expectation, with growing constructions of walls, impediment to mobility, and so on. So the resistance to climate change or climate refugees is not just around the climate dimension. It also stems from a resistance to the growing number of refugees, full stop, if I can put it that way.
Refugees in international law has a very specific and widely, almost universally accepted definition, that it refers to people who've left their country or place of origin and cannot return due to fear of persecution, violence, or in other words, person-made, human-made, government-made, violence-made circumstances. Displacement is not necessarily permanent, and it is, for the most part, permanent displacement. If it is permanent, is slow onset. It's going to take place over years. So we need to have a term that says global warming induced displacement or environmental degradation displacement, but not talk about people as refugees, because they're not necessarily persecuted and they aren't necessarily in fear of violence or even death at the hands of military regimes or whatever if they go back to their places of origin.
So de facto, we see already what we call a clause of non-refoulement, which effectively means sending back people to a place where they're at threat. And so the beginning of a jurisprudence is emerging on the subject. So the solutions and the ability to manage these are out there from a legal standpoint or from a framework standpoint. The issue, if you like, is a political will, number one, and number two, a very technical difficulty which stems from housing. There is a shortage of housing and a shortage of capacity to host the growing numbers of refugees globally, everywhere, especially if climate change adds constraints on habitability. It is definitely a challenge to have our urban cities, our urban environments, to be able to adapt the capacity of their own population right now. So when you add to that element the arrival of new populations, that adds strains obviously on that response. The displacement has started, but it hasn't kicked off in the numbers that one could expect this to be a challenge. So things can be organized now and need to be organized as of now. because in the future the scale could be so large if it's not addressed now through mitigation and adaptation that the response must be ambitious and must be happen now.
In situations where the arrival of new people does create some conflict. You see it in the pastoralist situations where the disappearance of wild grasslands means that nomadic herders end up wanting to herd their animals on areas that have been settled by settled farmers. And the question is, how do you reconcile and make sure that both the, shall we say, newcomers are able to make their way, have the rights and not be persecuted or excluded, and at the same time have access to employment and to ways of supporting themselves rather than becoming in some way wards of a state or wards of international organizations, as refugees that are pushed into camps and those camps are closed are in a situation where, of course, they are in need of assistance, they're given at least protection from not being returned, but what's of their lives if you're kept in what amounts to little more than a concentration camp, even if you have adequate food and health care and so on in that camp? I think the other question is the big question, and I think that's the question where you also need a huge amount of political will, because recreating infrastructure, building anew, doing different systems of slowing the impact of sea level rise is hugely expensive. Look what it cost over centuries for the Netherlands to build a huge, extensive system of dikes that has basically reclaimed half or more of that country's land surface from under the sea, or from under sea level.
There is definitely a need for a stronger and a response, legal framework, support. There is also a need for more response in terms of urban assistance, hosting, and so on. But there is also what is really truly challenged right now is also the very fundamentals of humanitarian principles. The principle of humanity, of impartiality and assistance itself is challenged at the greater level. So there is a need for a stronger global international solidarity. For now, we've seen, and we see it, is that countries of the developing South are facing the brunt of displacement, of these displacement, as well as the challenge in their development, and they need assistance, not just in terms of frameworks, but in terms of international solidarity, be it financial or in terms of burden sharing, in terms of resettlement of refugees in their location, which requires a greater understanding of what a climate refugee would be, as we said, in terms of the legal underpinning of what it is. And so we need those principles to be consolidated, brushed up anew, and to have a greater form of solidarity in order to render the existing mechanism more effective, in addition to adding new ones that would help with the emerging nature of the problem.
And I think the only alternative, and we've seen it a little bit with some of the organizing that's gone on, particularly by youth, to challenge and to raise the alarm, so to speak, but also to say we will we will engage in civil disobedience until something serious, effective, and sustainable is done. And I think it really comes down to political advocacy. It comes down to organizing communities to include in their program whatever it is. Demands that also say this needs to be done by our city, this needs to be done by the state, this needs to be done by regional authorities, this needs to be done by companies, and so on. So there's a huge contradiction between what needs to be done and what those who have the power to do are actually committing themselves to do.
The main challenge with the current displacement and the current threat that climate change poses is that we are all vulnerable to climate change. So how can you preserve your culture and identity when everyone else is facing the same challenge? So that there is no singularity of your own experience, your people's experience, but everyone else is moving at the same time because of the same reasons everywhere globally, is unheard of. So the question about the cultural heritage is a very good one, because we are really making a jump into the unknown, and the scale of it, and the mixing, and the displacement that it will generate, is on such a global scale, that we have nothing really to be able to sort of gauge that. What I know from my experience engaging with numerous countries and populations around that issue is that there's definitely a desire to be able to preserve that culture, and to preserve the culture also as a mean of survival, right? So in terms of, as you were saying, either coping mechanism or in terms of self-sustainability. So these dimensions will be important, but one has to also adapt. Displacement is a form of adaptation in and of itself to climate change. People have a tendency to think that our frameworks that we have usually were based on the idea that the displacement was to be stopped or prevented. And if it happened, then we needed to address it and make sure that people could go back. Whereas here we're talking about displacement as a form of adaptation in and of itself. So the populations themselves have to see it that way and adapt as they go along.
Well, that's a very broad question, but let me put it this way. Most cultures, including people like us who live in urban environments, have, as part of our identity, a cultural context that very much relates to the environment we're in. And the concern is particularly for people who remain more or less on the land, or remain in areas where being on the land, close to the land, or in some cases coastal areas, communities who are also dependent, for example, on seafaring and fishing, or Pacific Island communities, where it's not just a question of the land, it's a question of the environment around them that is destroyed or is deteriorating rapidly.
I think what we've seen with COVID is very telling of the nature of the challenges that we will be faced with. At many levels, right? So I'll take 2 examples. The first one is the fact that 2 years into this pandemic, we still struggle to see international solidarity in response to the COVID crisis. Right now, in certain countries, we're talking about vaccinating, giving a 3rd shot to the most vulnerable of populations in those countries, while the overwhelming majority of the international population, global population I should say, has not been vaccinated in the first place, or struggled to find vaccines. And the problem with this is also that these regions are regions where those variants can arise, leading to a need in the first regions to vaccinate even more, or to find new vaccines, and so on. So I think we face something similar with climate displacement, in the sense that if we do not help the other population, people will use migration as a form of adaptation, which will add stress to the hosting populations. And so if that dialogue and that doesn't happen, doesn't work just like it didn't with COVID, we're going to end up with extremely challenging times. The other issue where COVID is very instructive is if you look at the resistance of a large segment of the population to the vaccination itself. Just like there is a resistance to start the responses that are required, whether it's in terms of accepting that displacement is going to happen and how can it be preempted, or develop responses that will help that displacement happen with dignity, or put in place urban policies that will facilitate the arrival of new populations, or in any case help the hosting population that right now lives there, or make these regions habitable as long as possible. In addition, I should say, and a point that I haven't said enough in terms of mitigation, ensure that we mitigate and we respect the commitments that we're taking and heighten the commitments that everybody is taking in order to prevent the worst case scenario and ensure that the majority of this planet remains inhabitable for a majority of us.
To start with the question of the link, there is unfortunately probably a horrible link, because the effect on mobility and migration, not of the COVID pandemic itself so much as the responses that were, on the one hand, generally nationalistic, anti-multilateral, and individualistic, which, by the way, I interject, we see today in the fact that you now have 70-80% vaccination, full vaccination rates in some European countries and approaching that in North America. And you have not only an average of about 2% across the entire African continent, you have some countries where you can number in the thousands, only in the thousands, the number of people who have had vaccinations. And at the same time, I read the other day that the U.S. now has either bought, stockpiled, or on order 3.5 billion doses of COVID vaccination from now until the end of the year, when it's which is essentially enough for 10 doses for every one of the 350 million people, discounting that 60-some%, nearly 70% of the population is already vaccinated. You have a situation going on, and that I think represents what even former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown said, denounced as a moral outrage. And this, I think, comes back to the whole question that you're raising of the response to the pandemic and the lessons we need to learn vis-a-vis whether it's migrants, whether it's climate or global warming displacement or whatever, that no one is saved unless everyone is saved, so to speak. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And particularly in terms of global warming impacts, if there isn't a way to accommodate peacefully and productively people who have to move, and there's not going to be anyone immobile. If their land is completely flooded, they're going to move. And if there isn't a way to accommodate them, you're going to have people in situations that will only provoke violence, because there are quite a few people who would rather fight than die.